Well, thanks to Dr. Singh and the entire panel. I deeply appreciated both the insights and the optimism. I was also happy they ended on time, so we didn't have to cut the power to the entire auditorium that time. So that was good. I think I was struck by the parallels to the heart failure and structural heart field, in that we've made some substantial advances with devices. The genetics and the biological insights are slowly catching up, but haven't yet penetrated as much as we'd like to improving the therapy we can provide for our patients. And also the parallels that were drawn to the cancer field, where we always seem to be a little bit behind, in part because they have tissue access, and so they've had those biological insights for a longer period of time. And I guess we can all aspire to the day when we can actually bring those biological insights to novel small molecule therapies for these conditions as well.
Yes, agree completely. I also thought another theme that we're hearing emerge is this sense that there's an information content gap in almost every space, whether it's disease mechanism, whether it's value attribution, or even innovation and re-innovation. We really need better data flow, and we need to build strategies that bring that all together. So I think some excellent insights there, and would now like to move on to our next session, which is the first of our fireside chats. I'm going to introduce Paul LaViolette, who is Managing Partner and COO of SV Life Sciences Advisors. He's a Vice Chairman of the Innovation Advisory Board for Partners Health System, Chairman of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association, and was also a steering committee member. So we're deeply grateful to him. And he's going to be the host of the first chat, and I'd like to welcome him and Omar Ishrak to the stage.
Thank you. And really my pleasure to be here with Omar. Just a brief introduction, and then we'll get our chat started. But Omar has a remarkably diverse background. Born in Bangladesh and raised there, educated in London, graduating ultimately with a PhD in electrical engineering, ultimately moving on to industry, leading GE Healthcare for many years, which as a standalone company would be one of the largest medical technology platforms were it on its own. He then moved over to Medtronic and in 2011 and subsequently has created a very bold and broad vision for that company. I think everybody here knows Medtronic is the largest medical technology company and certainly the largest cardiovascular technology company in our industry. So Omar has a vast role shaping and driving that company. As I mentioned, his leadership impact has been bold. Just 3 years into his tenure at Medtronic, he orchestrated the largest acquisition in the history of the medical technology industry with the merger of Covidien into Medtronic. And Omar is driving a transformation of his company, and I think the industry is following, as he is highly focused on increasing patient access, lowering the total cost of care, and really driving a focus on economic value. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn, Omar, to you and ask the first question, really about the tension over value. Many would view that technology value is almost an oxymoron, particularly in med tech. If you go to payers, if you go to, unfortunately, many legislators in Washington, they will more often ascribe technology as a part of the problem in driving an acceleration in the cost of care. On the converse, your mission is to drive increased view toward economic value as a part of the solution. Maybe you can help dissolve that tension for us a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Paul, and thanks for that introduction. This whole question results from a gross misunderstanding of what medical technology is all about, and one that we should actively address, because I truly believe that if we don't, it's virtually existential for the medical device industry. And because of the things you just said, because if it's viewed as a cost with no value, when there's cost pressure, well, you take it out because there is no value. And that is the furthest thing from the truth, perhaps, because as we all know, medical technology does provide increased life expectancy, quicker recovery from illnesses, treatments that would otherwise not be possible, and in many ways in a more predictive way than, say, drugs. Medical technology provides engineered solutions for which outcomes are predicted over a fairly short period of time. In principle, they can also be measured because you're engineering a solution. And so medical device companies and the medical device industry lends itself to a value-based healthcare model pivoting on its core mission to continuously improve clinical outcomes. So I think explaining that and taking some leadership there, building business models around this is the way forward.
So maybe a couple of examples. There are maybe noteworthy negative examples in the technology race, if you will. As an example, surgical robotics have been around. They're now quite highly penetrated. There's quite a lot of controversy about whether those have ever been demonstrated to be cost-effective or not. So let's talk about a couple of recent Medtronic innovations, perhaps maybe the Micra pacemaker. Pacemakers generally would be viewed as somewhat of a commodity technology. Here comes an innovation in size. And then maybe in addition to that, you might comment on the LVAD space, where on an individual patient basis is one of the highest individual cost items, and your challenge is to focus on that versus maybe a lower cost care that might be more widely distributed and accessible. Let's talk about those.
Well, yeah, let's take all three of those, but let's say that the challenge for us as a whole is not to focus on one versus the other, but to focus on both, if all of that creates value. So if you can prove that all of those elements and all of those therapies and technologies in the end create value to a patient, which can be economically measured, then we should do all of them. I think that's pretty simple logic. So let's start with each one of those. Let's start with the surgical robotics. And there, it's true that a lot of this has been based on perception and reputation, but let's not minimize patient choice and patient comfort. So there's a clear choice there. But over time, look, Medtronic has been a leader in the move to minimally invasive therapies, from open surgery to minimally invasive therapies. And that journey, although we've moved a long way and have a lot of penetration in that area, it's nowhere near to the level that we expect it should be. The appeal of minimally invasive surgeries to a patient is quite obvious. You don't have an open surgery of minimally invasive. Recovery time is quicker. The outcomes have generally been shown to be much better. And the overall cost is lower because there's less recovery time. But the training process for minimally invasive surgery is difficult. It's a pretty, intensive training effort, and it's not always easy to get all physicians on board when they're used to doing the other way. Robotics will help us leapfrog that. Mm-hmm. Robotics will help us overcome that training phase and go straight to minimally invasive surgery. That's the value proposition. That's the way it has to be thought of. And the journey isn't complete till that is reached. And simply not something put in there for doctors to figure out what to do with it, but a real value proposition articulated and created. Mm-hmm. In the case of Micra, I think Micra is one of the most exciting things that has been developed in the past several decades. Here's a therapy that was supposed to be a commodity. And we've just built a new platform, which is now transcatheter based, whose recovery time is instant instead of a wound healing time, whose presence in the patient is completely invisible. And it's a platform that we're in the early phases of, which over time, we will build other types of CRM therapies based on the Micra. This is a change from the computer to the laptop, mm-hmm. or to the iPhone, or to the iPad. And there were lots of discussions at one time whether those would be viable or not. In truth, when there's real patient pull, these things are all viable. As to the economics, there's economics in Micra around lower complication rates. Mm-hmm. There's economics in Micra around return to work early. There's economics around more productivity. Those have to be articulated, and we plan to do all of that. Under no circumstances do we want to let that go simply as a nice technology feature that we did just because the engineers wanted to have some fun. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was not the point. The point was to make a true difference in people's lives. So, in all of those cases, you can see that the economic impact is not only important, it's vital that we articulate it and build business models around it through which we're accountable for actually delivering that value.
Speaking of business models, I know one of the technology marriages you've created is between the Tyrex pocket, surgical pocket, and the implant itself, which is going directly after infection reduction. Maybe you can describe how you're innovating there.
Well, that's a great example because just by way of clarity and background, Tyrex is an antibacterial sleeve which goes on a device, on an implantable cardiac device right now, although it could be broader. And what it does is it reduces the rate of infection, virtually eliminating any infection at all from the wound. Now, it so happens that in high-risk patients, and by high risk we say with the larger implantable devices like ICDs and CRT devices, and with reimplants, which are done because of battery changeouts, the infection rate is something like 2 to 4%. By using Tyrex, that goes down to virtually zero, little under 0.5%, and for intents and purposes, it doesn't exist. And this is one where we've developed a business model where we essentially guarantee that if a patient with a Tyrex, we have to make sure that they actually get the Tyrex, gets an infection, we will pay not only for the sleeve, but we will pay for the entire repeat procedure, which to a hospital today has a net impact of about $10,000. But the true cost to a payer for this is more like $70,000. They're just reimbursing again. They're reimbursing again because that's a new condition, which should never have happened to start with. And so this tremendous saving. In this, when you scale this across the US, the amount of cost that there is because of reinfections for these high-risk patients is something like $500 million a year. And you can solve this simply by putting in an antibacterial sleeve, the recovery of which is almost guaranteed, and there is no other action that a doctor or a caregiver or a patient has to take to get that recovery. Why wouldn't someone do this? And someone doesn't do this today automatically because the payment mechanism will not recognize the value because it happens well after the implantation procedure. So therefore, we're building a business model where we, in fact, in simplistic terms, essentially guarantee the result. And those are things that we will do. And we would like to actually push for legislation or do some pilots with CMMI where such therapies, coming from any medical device company, where the outcome is not dependent on any other variable except the technology in its own. And the technology company is willing to kind of sign up for that outcome, that there should be prior reimbursement because it's not going to cost the healthcare system anything to do that. So those are the kinds of things, the sort of steps that one can take in today's world, which are small steps but with big impact that we want to take on our journey to a more holistic view of value-based healthcare.
Well, it's a leadership strategy. I want to talk about leadership overall within Medtronic. This is a company that is a leader in spine, it's a leader in deep brain stimulation, it's a leader in neuromodulation and spinal cord stimulation. So you're a leader in many things, and yet it was impressive to me that as we had a CEO panel a little while ago, really Medtronic is trying to be the leader in all of the categories that all of those CEOs were trying to lead in. So you have an enormous array of markets to go after. Cardiovascular, really a legacy company from the days that Earl Bakken created pacemakers through to today. So how do you decide cardiovascular, non-cardiovascular? How do you drive the cardiovascular strategy within the company? How do you make those priority decisions as we look at all of the under-penetrated and under-cared for, if you will, diseases, whether it's AFib, previously mentioned, or heart failure, soon to be covered, versus all the others that you can go after?
Well, let me point out two principles in the company, two principal kind of philosophies in the company. One is that we participate in areas that we can make a difference and avoid areas where we cannot make a difference. Now, that doesn't mean we don't go into new things. But if we do go into new things, we make sure that we stay in there till we're successful and big with scale. And we go in there with that, knowing that that level of investment will be required. And so when you talk about these different areas, each of those areas have their own focus, and they're viewed, and they themselves are big enough so that they can justify a business model that's effective that adds up to an effective, diversified business in all of Medtronic, and then we share amongst ourselves different technologies, different types of infrastructure to give us a competitive advantage. The other philosophy in Medtronic, which I want to make very clear, is that this is a company whose core mission is to invent new technologies to change outcomes. And these are very specific to patients and physicians. And as far as I'm concerned, I want a particular physician, say an EP, to think of Medtronic as just an EP company, because they don't care that we're in spine. And for them, we should be as focused on them as a dedicated EP company would be. That's the challenge that I put to our team. And that's the way we try to organize ourselves, while at the same time, look at our overall scale to provide efficiencies of scale, to provide cross-learning, to provide interchange of ideas, interchange of selling, build partnerships with bigger stakeholders because we get a seat at the table. So that's the way we use scale. But that scale should never be a compromise for focus. Because in healthcare, that focus and intimate connection with the physician cannot be replaced with anything. It cannot be replaced with size. That can only be replaced, that can only be sort of encouraged, and that judgment developed over time is the key to success of a medical device company.
You're also trying to use that scale to improve global reach.
That's right.
You've been very vocal about trying to deliver solutions worldwide to every patient who needs it. How do you compare that mission to the one that I alluded to earlier with, let's say, an LVAD, where we have a very concentrated patient population today on the bridge or destination indications in the US, maybe 10,000 patients total, and with a single device cost of somewhere between 85 and 125,000. Life-saving, life-sustaining, in contradistinction to the vast breadth of your reach worldwide with more cost-effective technology.
Yeah, you can see where I'm going with this. The one thing that we have to be clear about is that if it provides incremental value, it doesn't matter how we get that. Whether it's to those 10,000 people or it's to hundreds of millions out somewhere in some country who don't have access. The fact that there are hundreds of millions there and 10,000 here doesn't mean that the 10,000 aren't important.
As a non-zero-sum game.
Yeah, it's a completely a non-zero-sum game. It's completely additive. And that's the way we look at it. And in LVADs, we do look at the economics of this. Life extension has got economic value. And over time, we keep working this. The devices will get smaller and cheaper and more affordable. It's not a 1-year journey. It's a decades-long journey. And we are committed to getting there. And that doesn't mean that in the short term, the people we can help, we shouldn't help. We absolutely will. So that's the way we're approaching it. As a non-zero-sum game is probably the best way to look at it.
Resources within Medtronic are somewhat of a zero-sum game eventually. I'm curious how you think about innovation. The company has been not only innovative in technology, but really in creating markets, and has enormous experience and leverage to do that. At the same time, some of your best, most recent commercial successes have been from acquired platforms, whether that is hardware or CryoCath or CoreValve and maybe 12 and some of the other things that are earlier for the future.
Right. Yeah.
So how are you thinking about acquiring versus developing? How difficult is it now to develop in this more complex structure you have to feed that many franchises? And maybe share with us your thoughts just about internal versus external resource allocation to growth.
I think, that's one of the challenges that as a business grows, one has to keep in front of. But there's certain, again, key principles that is inherent in the culture of Medtronic that I've valued enormously. And one of those is that there's a healthy respect for what's done outside and a ready recognition that all inventions are not going to come out of Medtronic, no matter how much money we spend and how smart we are. Because there are going to be smart people outside of Medtronic, and there are going to be more people outside of Medtronic than in Medtronic. It's pretty clear logic. So there is going to be activity outside that we will miss. And so there's a ready recognition of that. And based on that, we have a very active look at both internal and external approaches to new therapies. In many cases, the same team is held accountable, whether it's acquired or internally developed. When the task has got very high risk, many times we will start an internal development program and do minority investments in other areas, and then see which ones work, because all approaches aren't going to work. And sometimes a bet that you made externally is probably moving ahead more quickly and has better results than what you're doing internally. When that happens, the business team has a responsibility to balance out the costs. I mean, then you got to shut one down, and people know how to do that. So there is a healthy balance, and I do think that the culture in Medtronic over the years, long before I joined Medtronic, is one where that approach is quite natural. And I find that to be very, very, very healthy. I think internally, I have to say that, well, two things. First of all, when we do acquire, and in many of the examples that you gave, we put in a lot of work before those things actually become products. I mean, the transcatheter valve, we held that business without any revenue for like 4 or 5 years, spent a lot of money buying it, spending a lot of money on clinical trials, further developing the product, and then we go to market. There have been failures in those, or at least temporary failures, like our hypertension acquisition, which we haven't given up on. Because in principle, we think that's the right thing to do, but it hasn't had the results. That doesn't mean we won't do acquisitions again. Mm-hmm. So that's the way in which we look at this culturally. But equally, I have to say that I'm proud of our internal team for developing breakthrough technology, truly disruptive breakthrough technologies in the size and complex and sort of perceived complexity of a company that we are. Let me name them. Link, a revolutionary product which no one thought was even expecting. It's a diagnostic device that's the size of a matchstick that's critical in AFib situations and stroke prevention. A Micra that we just talked about, a reinvention of a pacemaker which was supposed to be a commodity, which our internal team completely developed from scratch. The hybrid closed loop diabetes pump, a product we've been working on for 15 years. We didn't stop, we continued to invest over and over again as we learned. And the team finally came out with a product which we think will be a game changer and years ahead of anybody else. I mean, there are others. And so for a company of this size to be so active in disruptive technology must mean that over the decades, past leadership of Medtronic has created a culture which encourages this type of innovation. And I think I've just been fortunate to kind of inherit that. And I guess my biggest task was not to screw that one up.
So far, I think so good. A question came in from the audience, Omar, and I'm going to ask that you maybe broaden your answer to think about really evolving into the services business. But how are you defining success for the Medtronic Care Management Services remote patient monitoring platform? So think about that answer and then really moving beyond products.
Yeah, I think, I really don't like to use the word services too much because that looks like it's not patient related. It's just a service that one provides, and it's not related to our therapies. I think in the end, value-based healthcare will depend, successful implementation of value-based healthcare will depend not only the therapy itself, but it'll depend on some form of care management that's required to reach the promised outcome. Medtronic is on a journey to change ourselves from a company who was paid on a technology with a promise to improve the outcome. Now that promise is not empty. It's with clinical papers, with peer-reviewed articles, with clinical trials and all of that, but a promise nonetheless, in that we get paid when the technology is deployed. To a company which gets paid in some fashion when the outcome is reached. That's a big difference. The promised outcome is actually delivered. And to do that, we need to go beyond the therapy itself, and in many ways, care management and post-acute care is a big portion of this. And in the short term, a lot of this can be achieved through care coordination, but in the long term, if you want to make a continuous effort at continuous efficiency, you need to have science and technology. You need to understand cohorts, you need to understand how to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time, and that'll result in continuous improvement in care, improvement in outcomes, and lowering of cost. And I firmly believe that value-based healthcare will lead to healthcare being an economic growth driver as viewed by governments around the world, as opposed to being a cost burden. That's the journey and the mission that we collectively have to take on, because I think that's completely rational and reachable.
So let's talk about the journey and the mission for maybe two diseases. The AFib panel preceded us, and the heart failure panel will follow us. You're a leader in both. You have an AFib, you have remote monitoring, you have catheter-based interventions, obviously with your IPGs, sensing and treating AFib. Heart failure, of course, is one of our biggest expenses. Incidence is increasing. Every heart failure hospitalization is a $20,000 expense for the healthcare system. And we're really not altering, as yet, the survival curve for heart failure patients. So maybe just spend a minute on each of those two disease pathways and talk about how Medtronic is uniquely capable of altering the strategy of patient care.
Mm-hmm. I think the right way to think about both of those and other diseases as well is to think about breaking down the care strategy into two pieces. Two sort of groups of activities. One is episodic care, and the other is chronic disease management. And in both situations, both AFib and heart failure, in many ways they're even related to each other, are cases of chronic disease management in which an episode is interleaved. So in the case of AFib, there's some kind of chronic disease. It escalates to a point where an ablation procedure is necessary, and then that procedure puts the patient back into chronic care management. If the chronic care management is not done right, you will get repeated escalations, you'll get repeated procedures, and the cost overall will go up. So the two have to be tied together in some fashion. The other thing worth noting in situations like this is that the way in which you move to a value-based healthcare platform in each of those is that the outcome measures for episodic care are actually quite different from the outcome measures from chronic care. Because episodic care actually relates to not only the measurement of the success of the intervention, but also the measurement of the process of recovery. A patient walks in the door and has surgery. You've just put that patient through a level of acuity that's worse than what they were when they walked in. And so you have to make sure that that process of recovery from that level of acuity is in fact done right at a certain time frame. And the measures for that are completely different from how one would measure that patient to make sure that their chronic disease management is not escalating. And so it's important to separate those. And in both of those situations, we kind of look at those in targeted fashion. So for the AFib, we look at the AFib procedure itself. But we don't lose sight of the fact that the person has been there for a certain reason. And we are trying to look upstream to see what's required to manage the patient in his or her chronic care state to prevent them going into that AFib procedure. And equally, once the patient is released after the treatment, then is the process of recovery adequate? Is there a care management through which any change in ongoing treatment is adhered to by the patient, any change in medication? Is there a way in which new outcome measures are set for that patient that are measured on a periodic basis so they don't have to go back and have another AFib procedure? Or if they do, at least certain screens are in place through which they're escalated. And heart failure is a similar kind of thing where the episode could be something as big as an LVAD, or it could be earlier stage where it's simply a visit to a hospital because of decompensation, or some other problem like that, where again the episode is smaller, but then the chronic care management is longer. A CRT device, for example, is a heart failure treatment device, and yet it shocked me, for example, when I found out that even after a patient gets a CRT device, their rate of hospitalization a year after that is still completely unacceptable. Yeah. And it's something that we collectively have to do something about. And we have to manage those patients in a way that we reduce that rate of rehospitalization. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, except to say that looking at episodes and chronic care separately is important. Looking at cohorts in each of those situations is important. Being clear about the outcome measures, and in the end being accountable for those outcome measures is the way we're thinking about that. And then understanding the clinical problem in depth.
So many diseases, so little time.
That's correct.
We have 2 minutes. I'd love your thoughts on what most excites you about what's next for Medtronic. You have a number of new platforms in research. You mentioned, as an example, the Simplicity work that has been undertaken with hypertension, a big problem, not successful the first time through, but may well be the next time. with investments in mitral valve and so many structural heart areas, peripheral vascular disease. Tell me what you think might be the subject of a discussion like this, maybe 3 or 4 years from now on this stage.
Well, you know, I hate to pick any one because they're all
You
exciting.
love all your children.
Yeah, you have to, and I do. But you know, if I were to pick one or two, I've got to go back to the Micra. I think for a company which was founded on the invention of a pacemaker, you know, 60 years later to reinvent that pacemaker, and the same thing that the pacemaker did in 1952 or whenever it was first introduced, it created from it more sophisticated cardiac rhythm devices. I'm convinced that the Micra will be the platform for a new generation of cardiac rhythm devices which are put in minimally invasively, that have all kinds of other features and diagnostics that today's devices cannot have. And we will probably think, you know, 20 years from now, or maybe 10 years from now, that the implantable pacemaker is ancient history. Because of the nature of the transcatheter-based cardiac rhythm devices. But that truly is a platform that I'm excited about, especially given the history of Medtronic. I think the other ones that I mentioned briefly are all ones that are worthy of note. I think the way in which the transcatheter valve for aortic diseases is moving ahead is particularly interesting as that goes to lower and lower risk populations. Does that become true standard of care for a majority of patients? And I got to leave you with the diabetes opportunity in front of us. There too, I think we're in the infancy. We're in the infancy of what an artificial pancreas can do. It'll again look sort of ancient and crude 10 years from now. When we look at what we did today. But for today, it's a big step. So what excites me most about innovation in healthcare is that one thing we all know for certain, that our quest for improved clinical outcomes is never going to go away. Our desire to extend lives, our desire to recover from illnesses more quickly, that is you know, eternal. And one that very few other industries have the good fortune to participate in, and we collectively can be in that area. Whatever we do, it's not going to be lost in the noise somewhere. It's going to make a difference, and that's a tremendous blessing we all have.
Well, thank you, Omar. Great comments from a great leader, obviously a visionary for Medtronic, and as an industry, we're thankful that you're at the helm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.